This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show as together we hear how they are making their world better. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Welcome, everybody, to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. So glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in today. So, my guest today, Dr. Dipesh Navsaria. He is a wonderful leader that's doing some great work, particularly when it comes to the issue of children living in poverty right here in the U.S. He's going to talk a bit about his work there, and his specific initiative that he's a part of called Reach Out and Read has actually turned into a podcast, which he is the host of, which we're going to explore a little bit more and hear more about what his goals are for this podcast initiative. But first, I wanted to pass on to you. Many of you know that I provide leadership and life coaching, and it's been so much fun working with clients who are leaders just like you, looking to grow personally and professionally. What you may not know is that I also provide consulting services. In fact, currently I'm working for an organization to help them create a clear strategy and communication plan to raise $3.5 million to expand their organization. So perhaps you're an executive director and you sense your organization has hit a lid on growth and you need a strategy as to how you can scale your nonprofit. Or perhaps the culture you set out to create is not the culture you have currently and it's impacting your staff retention. Or maybe you're facing a major resource challenge and you don't know what to do. Well, that's where I can help. I come alongside leaders and organizations to help create strategies to grow their organizations and maximize their impact. So if your nonprofit needs help with fundraising, with strategy, or operational effectiveness, reach out today. You can just simply email me at rob@robharder.com. You can actually call me too. My number is 435-776-5173. Again, 435-776-5173. You can also go to my website, robharder.com, to find out more. Okay, now on to today's specific podcast. As I mentioned, I've got Dr. Dipesh Navsaria, and he's got this really interesting initiative he's been a part of, and he's going to talk a bit more about what they're doing. He's going to give a little bit of background on the issues of children living in poverty right here in the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, and the impact it's having on these children and their families. And he'll talk also about the solutions they're coming up with, about what they're trying to do to accomplish and help families break out of the cycle and provide them with the support that they need. Along the way, he started this podcast called the Reach Out and Read podcast initiative. And so he's going to talk a bit about the guests he's having on the show and how that's raising more awareness about this really, really critical issue. So as always, love having you a part of this show. And thanks for joining. Now on to today's show. Great to have you on the show today, Doctor. Thanks for taking time to join us.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
You bet. Okay, so let's start out by giving my audience a quick overview of your background and a summary of your Reach Out and Read podcast series.
Sure. So my background, I'm someone who took the scenic route through his education. I have a master's in public health. I also have a master's in library science, and I was a physician assistant before, and then went to med school and am a pediatrician. So all of those things play into my life in some way, shape, or form now.
Well, it's always fun to have a fellow podcaster on the show. So could you talk just a bit about the Reach and Read podcast series specifically?
Yeah, so the Reach Out and Read podcast is the podcast of the organization Reach Out and Read, which is 35 years old. The podcast is not 35 years old, obviously. We're in our 5th season now. And we get the opportunity on that podcast to talk about, honestly, anything and everything having to do with children and families, children's books and illustrations, policy, parenting, you name it. So this fall, in our 5th season, we decided for the first time to do a 5-part series, which we're in the middle of dropping right now as we record this. And it's really looking at children in poverty and many ways to think about and talk about that whole phenomenon and try to enlighten our viewers into ways of how they can think about it.
Okay, as I understand it, you're working to raise awareness about children living in poverty right here in the US. So for my listeners, let's review a few facts just to put this issue into perspective. First, what percentage of children under the age of 18 in the US are living in poverty, according to the US Census Bureau? And what are some of the long-term impacts of childhood poverty on health and well-being?
We could spend some time digging into all sorts of crazy, detailed policy issues around how we even measure poverty, but I'll spare your listeners that. But to say that if you look at one of the most common ways in which we measure child poverty in the American Community Survey, the national child poverty rate was about 16%. Now, I want to put that into a little bit of context here, which is that is higher than the overall poverty rate. So let's let that sink in, right? Children are more likely to live in families that are living in poverty than adults are, or seniors, or things like that. And that's not to discount poverty and for anyone, but it's to say, like, yikes, children in the US, that's really significant. And we can talk about how that has also changed. There was a big drop in the poverty rate just about 3 years ago, in the child poverty rate. And then it went shooting back up. And that's because one of the most successful sets of anti-poverty measures that we've ever done in the history of the United States was related to the pandemic, led to historically low rates of child poverty. My goodness, right? We finally solved it. And then we declined to continue those programs in the last couple of years. And that's on Congress's watch that's happened. So.
Now, speaking of that, how much more likely are children in poverty to experience adverse childhood experiences, or called ACEs for short, compared to their peers from what you've seen, and why is this so important to address?
So, adverse childhood experiences, or as it's sometimes called ACEs, is something we've been talking about for, probably a good 20 years or even more. And we've come to recognize that adversity in childhood, what happens in childhood, does not stay in childhood. There are very measurable effects that this has on human health and well-being over the lifespan. So, for example, if you look at the number of categories of adversity that someone said, yes, this happened to me as a child, you look then at their risk of heart disease as an adult, right, in their 50s, 60s, et cetera, they're much higher, much, much higher. And we have biological mechanisms and all sorts of things by which we can measure this and show this. There's, assays of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and epigenetic studies and all sorts of things. Like, this is measurable in very clear ways. However, what we recognize is that adversity is much more common in children living in poverty. And of course, people listening to this might say, well, duh, of course it is, right? If you don't have enough food, you don't have stable housing, et cetera, et cetera. But I also want to point out that adversity is not limited to those living in poverty. Even those with substantial incomes can experience significant levels of adversity, and it too can have an effect on their long-term health as well.
So from your experience, what are some of the significant factors that can really help families coping with chronic adversity that you have seen?
So about 12 years ago, there was a landmark policy statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics that really laid out for the first time in a medical context, how do we think about all this, right? And it laid out all this stuff about adversity and something we call toxic stress, which is kind of unmodified kind of major stressors that go on for a long period of time in a child's life. The problem with that report, and the authors themselves recognized this, was that it was a very medical report in the sense that it talked about what was wrong, all the deficits, all the issues. It was very negatively oriented. It wasn't strengths-based. So when a revision to this came out 10 years later, so relatively recently now, they said, all that stuff we said is true. Like, please don't throw that out. But now we need to talk about the solution. And the solution is, how do we build, in contrast to adverse childhood experiences, how do we create positive childhood experiences? And what some of the work has shown is that positive childhood experiences are, in a sense, even more powerful than the adverse childhood experiences. So believe it or not, a child who's had little to no adversity, but little to no positive experiences, does worse than a kid who's had some adversity, but has also had good positive experiences. And that's some of the most recent thinking and scholarship on this has been, wait a minute, does that mean that having a challenge, but then followed by repair, what they call rupture and repair, is that really like better? Yes, because I think a lot of people think, oh, no child should ever have to experience stress. And it's like, my goodness, no, 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 no. Stressful circumstances are how we build new skills and build coping mechanisms. For example, you and I are recording this podcast right now. If suddenly the whole system crashes and we have to scramble to get back on and we have to piece together the audio, right? I don't know about you, but I know I and my producer have been there on our podcast, and we've, and we've made it work, right? And we've figured it out and we've figured out how to deal with those circumstances. It's no different for any other situation that's out there.
That's really fascinating. So essentially, you were saying that aiming for a stress-free childhood is not ideal or the goal, but rather this idea of rupture and learning how to repair and deal with that stress, that really is what we should aim for. Now, why hasn't this been emphasized more in your opinion?
I think to a certain extent, it comes down to some expectations we have about what it means to be a child at this point in human history, right? So let's remember about 120 years ago, right? Your chances of surviving the first year of life or the first 5 years of life were not high. It hasn't been that long since we've lived in an environment where we say, hey, wait a minute, children, are likely, when they're born, they're likely to grow up to adulthood and not just grow, but to flourish and thrive. So I think we have this idea sometimes that like, oh, no stressor should happen. And we don't recognize that that's actually a necessary and important thing, that tolerable stress actually is important.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is donorbox.org. Hey friends, thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Many of you know that I provide leadership and life coaching. With my 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard leaders like you work. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on and to get help with the barriers and leadership challenges you will face both professionally and personally. I really want to help people thrive and become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. And it's been so much fun working as a coach, working with clients who are leaders just like you, looking to grow personally and professionally. What you may not know is that I also provide consulting services. Currently, in fact, I'm working with an organization to help them create a clear strategy and plan to raise $3.5 million to expand their organization. So perhaps you're an executive director and you sense your organization has hit a lid on growth and you need a strategy as to how you can scale your nonprofit. Or perhaps the culture you set out to create is not the culture you have currently and it's impacting your staff retention. Or maybe you're facing a major resource challenge and you don't know what to do. That's where I can help. I come alongside leaders and organizations to create strategies to grow their organizations and maximize their impact. If your nonprofit needs help with fundraising, strategy, or operational effectiveness, reach out today. You can simply email me at rob@robharder.com. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or you can call me, 435-776-5173. I would be happy to provide a free sample coaching session or a consult to see how I can best be of help to you and your organization. Well, thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Well, I know you deal with a lot of challenges and have to manage a lot of stress yourself. So I always like to ask this question of my guests. With all that you're working on, what is giving you hope these days?
One of the solutions that was laid out in that policy statement that I referenced from the American Academy of Pediatrics was that we need to be thinking and talking about something that's called relational health. And many people may not be familiar with this term, but it's the science of looking and thinking about the health of relationships. So not just the parent or caregiver, not just the child, but what about the space between them, right? How do they connect with one another? How do they interact with one another? And again, it comes back to that whole rupture and repair idea, right? We don't ever want to tell parents or have them feel like if you don't pay attention to your child 100% of the time, every single second, you're going to harm them, right? Like, no, you have to be able to look away. You have to be able to do other things, and so on. That's not feasible. You'll drive yourself bonkers as a parent. It is not possible. But how are we able to tell that child, hey, even if I'm not paying attention to you right at that moment, I'll be back in a moment. Don't worry. Have that expectation that I will be back, and so on. All these sorts of little micro interactions. So even in a family that's facing immense challenges, right? Lack of employment, maybe housing insecurity, food insecurity, etc. I am not by any means pretending that we can fill a child's stomach just with the right interaction, right? That's crazy. No, that we shouldn't ever be thinking that. But amidst all this adversity, can we create circumstances, small moments in which that child knows, okay, but my caregiver's still here, and my caregiver loves me, and my caregiver will respond to me. Maybe not every single second, but I know that they're still there. If we can do that, that's a measure of strong relational health, and it can serve as a buffer against many of these other things until we get our acts together as a society and figure out how to solve hungry children and people without housing and things like that.
So you're saying that relational health is just as important as physical health. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, they both interplay off of each other. For example, if a parent is in chronic pain, right? Let's say they have some medical condition that's unaddressed because they don't have health insurance or something like that. It is really hard to tend to your child's needs, emotional or otherwise, when you have that added burden. So let's recognize that they interact with each other as well.
Okay, now let's talk a bit more about your podcast, Reach Out and Read initiative. First of all, who are some of the guests that you've had on the show, and what are your main goals with this podcast?
So let me actually, if I can just talk about Reach Out and Read as a organization for a moment, because then it'll highlight what we're trying to do in the podcast. So Reach Out and Read is a program that's been around for 35 years. It was this brilliant idea by someone way smarter than me who said, why don't we take these checkups that kids have so frequently early in life, from birth to age 5, that's about 14, regular checkups that happen. Let's take advantage of that opportunity and talk to families about the importance of sharing books with one another, asking about how it's going, and offer troubleshooting advice, or simply saying, yes, you're doing it right, and all those things. And we give them a book. We walk in with a age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, brand new, lovely, diverse, high-quality book in our hands, and we give it directly to the child. Why? Because we want to watch what they do with it. We want to watch their reaction, the parent's reaction. Does that toddler take that book and go toddling over to their parent and hold it out in that read to me gesture? If they do, they've just told me so much, right? They're saying, I know what this thing is. This is that thing that if I take it over to you and hold it out, I think you're going to pull me up in your lap. You're going to open this book and we're going to look at it together, and I want you to do it. That is a beautiful measure, an assessment of relational health right there, right in front of me in the exam room. And then we have a chance. The parent might say, well, my toddler, he used to like being read to, but he doesn't like it anymore. Oh, that's interesting. Well, it turns out, right, that maybe their child is just, toddlers have a naturally short attention spans. That is completely normal. But they're discouraged. Oh, he doesn't like it. No, he likes it just fine. He's just, let him hold a book. Look for things in the pictures. Make up stories about the pictures, right? We're not going to make you write an essay on it, So when we do all this, we're trying to make books and the shared book reading experience. Okay, people sometimes say, oh, you're a book giveaway program. Well, we are giving away books, but we're secretly a parenting support program. We're building the skills in that family to have these moments that matter together with one another. So all this stuff I just went on about with relational health, to a parent, like, okay, that's nice, but I have no clue what you really mean. How's that supposed to look at home? But we can say, share books together, even if it's a few minutes before bedtime, even if you're busy, just build it into where you can. That's relational health building. So yes, we're an early literacy program, but we're also a relational health building program in that way. We didn't have the words for it 35 years ago, but we've been doing it all along.
Now, thanks for the background on that program. Now, I would like to talk about the series itself, perhaps. Talk a bit about the origins of it, and what do you really hope to accomplish through this podcast initiative?
Gosh, I was an undergraduate randomly working as a research assistant on a child development project in Boston back when Reach Out and Read was maybe 4 years old. And I heard about this program. And then I encountered it when I was in physician assistant school. It had been implemented at that clinic. I set it up in a clinic I worked in as a PA in outpatient pediatrics. And then when I came to Wisconsin for my pediatric residency training, we had no statewide affiliate here. So I helped set that up. And then I've now been on the board for Reach Out and Read National for a number of years. And then now hosting this podcast, which is one of the good things that came out of the pandemic, was saying, hey, let's try this out in some way. So as I said, this is one of the good things that came out of the pandemic. We started, like many organizations, to have a massive national staff call, right? Just to kind of stay connected and all. And we had some really neat and interesting speakers. And I said to our CEO at the time, I said, gosh, I'd love to have some way of sharing this with the wider world. And we decided that we wanted to keep our speaker conversations within the organization, just, logistically. But he said, we've talked about a podcast before. Here, let's put a few dollars into this. Got an amazing, excellent producer who I still work with. And we started with a twice a month podcast, and we've won 2 national awards. So yay, thank you. And I honestly think it's some of the best work I've ever had a chance to do, because we get to have, I'm sure you're familiar with this, we get to have interesting conversations with all sorts of amazing people, children's book authors and illustrators, national kind of people thinking about, policy and children and all. We've had academics on, we've had, healthcare practitioners. It just runs the gamut. And we've been able to really tell so many great stories to people. And I actually I teach an undergraduate class and a graduate public health class, and I make them listen to some episodes because it's already there. Here, listen to this. So, yeah. So a lot of good storytelling about how we can make the world of children and families better, right? Through the ideas and resources and thoughts that are out there, and that's what led us to this 5-part series on children and poverty.
All right. Well, so as people are listening to your podcast or listening to this podcast and they're tuning in to all the work that you're doing, what do you want those who are listening to take away from your work?
I think recognizing that when children and their families face challenges, these are actually solvable problems, and that it's not inevitable that these things are just like they're going to happen, so why even try? Human beings can actually make these changes, and we actually have good examples. And the things that are keeping us from being successful are not a lack of solutions, but it's actually a lack of whether we're willing to implement them, and how we get people to think about this in the ways that are real and true, and not because of ideas that people want to put out there because they don't want to make these sorts of investments. In general, I think there's a lot we talk about in the Reach Out and Read podcast like this, and it's particularly true in this series on children and poverty.
Okay, well, if you were to map out the next 1 or 2 or even 3 years, where would you like to see this initiative take the organization?
So this is part of the Reach Out and Read in its strategic plan has announced a very bold, dare I say, audacious goal. We'll go with it. That by 2030 we want to reach at least 50% of all children under age 5 in the U.S. So our model is, again, birth to age 5. Yeah, there's no reason we shouldn't be there by 2030. There's very few programs out there that have that kind of scale. Now, I want to be really clear. I don't believe that talking to families about shared reading together, again, is going to solve a lack of housing, right? Let's get real. But we need to recognize that at the same time that we have amazing evidence-based programs that are intensive, like home visiting, but there's no way you can get that to more than a small percentage of the people that need it because it costs money. We also need evidence-based, like Reach Out and Read, broadly scalable programs, right, that can help with folks whose needs aren't as intense and that can't hurt for those who have much more intensive needs, right? In fact, they probably help just the scale of their need is much greater. We need an ecosystem of supports, right? So in the same way that everything I've just said today is about how do we adjust the environments around children and families, whether it's that micro environment of what happens at home, that middle environment of what's happening in communities and what are the resources that are available, or more broadly speaking, what's the policy landscape at the societal level, right, that makes a difference. All of these are about how we can adjust. It's what we call the social ecological model. It's the same sort of idea here that we can live in this ecosystem of supports that Reach Out and Read sits somewhere in that middle space. We need broader solutions, and we need to be friends to those people with broader solutions and them to be friends to us. And same with those micro solutions and everything in between, right? That all of these things interplay and support one another and are part of solutions. We're all in this together. Like, we're not competitors.
All right. Well, how can my listeners who are really wanting to find out a little bit more about you and find out more about your work, where would you send them?
Yeah. So for the work of Reach Out and Read, go right to our website, which is reachoutandread, all one word, .org, or just type Reach Out and Read into Google. It'll come right up. And our website has a ton of great resources about the program and also a great early literacy research library that they've put together and so on. The podcast is also housed on there, and you can find all, I think today's recording might have been episode 120. So yeah, there's hours and hours and hours of listening that people can avail themselves of if they so desire.
Hey friends, well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening. And until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.